Hi, I'm Maria Theoharis Sews on social media. Welcome back to Sew Over 50's podcast on Sew Organised Style. Make sure you like and subscribe to Sew Organised Style podcast on your podcast app, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I find this often with sewing. I think it's a very reassuring activity. I think it sort of gave me something to do and think about and focus on when things felt a little bit wobbly. So yeah, I don't know. I think most sewists probably would have that experience in some way or another.
That's Maddie Ballard, the author of Patchwork, a Sewist Diary. On another topic, if you live in Australia and decide to purchase your own Mimiqueen, I'll be your body scanner. Go to mimiqueens.com to book your body scan session in Australia. Now, let's grab a cuppa to hear Maddie's story.
Hello.
Hi, Maddie. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Maria. How are you?
Good, thank you. Maddie, I'm really pleased that you could come onto the podcast today. And it was great that I actually got a chance to read your book, which is all about your sewing journey, but also your life.
Yeah, I'd say that's right, Maria. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat about it.
That's okay. Tell me about your background because you've got a New Zealand accent, but I don't think that's where you originated from.
That's right. So I was born in the States. So my dad is an American and my mum is a Chinese New Zealander. And so when I was about 3, we moved back from Syracuse, New York to Auckland, New Zealand, which is where my mum's parents lived. And I grew up in New Zealand and then I kind of from there spent some time living in the UK and now I live in Melbourne in Australia. I think in the past I've been told that I sound a little bit English, which I sort of hate being told,
Oh,
but it's all right. I think my accent is a bit mixed.
it's good that you've lived in various countries because then you've been able to see what life is like and the things that you like and things that you'd like to like put aside and forget all about.
Yes, yeah. I think
Yeah.
it's always a great experience to live in lots of different places, and I feel very lucky to have been able to do that.
Yeah. When you started writing Patchwork, a Sewist Diary, what started you off on that journey?
I think I started writing the book sort of by accident. The first chapter I wrote was one about making a coat, and I made the coat in the wake of quite a serious breakup. And so I think I was just looking for something to do. I don't know. I think maybe I started writing that essay initially because the coat was the most complicated thing I'd made at that point. And so I felt like it was a process I wanted to document. And I noticed while I was documenting the kind of practical part of the process that there was sort of an emotional component as well going on. I was kind of writing about, the sort of fiddly work of getting the lining to sit inside the shell and making everything line up and sort of dealing with this incredibly heavy wool. But I guess at the same time, I was trying to sort out my feelings about what was going to happen now and where I should live and what my life would look like. So those two came together.
Most people would think, oh, if you're going to sew a coat, you go through certain steps, but you were actually going through a lot more than just knowing how to put a coat together.
I find this often with sewing. I think it's a very reassuring activity. I think it sort of gave me something to do and think about and focus on when things felt a little bit wobbly. So yeah, I don't know. I think most sewists probably would have that experience in some way or another.
We can buy labels to put into our clothes that reflect our mood, like a sweary sewist, those sorts
Yeah.
of things. I noticed that from your writing, you've gotten through quite a few challenges in your life, and sewing played a big part in that.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think I tend to be a very emotional person. And so even when things are not necessarily like an objectively a big deal, I often experience them as kind of being destabilizing or world shifting in some way. And I think having a creative outlet is a really nice way of kind of dealing with those emotions.
So, the first garments that you sewed, you described them as wonky. And I know a lot of people would relate to that. Do you still have those first garments that you sewed, or have they gone on to another life?
I've got some of them. I think the dress that I describe in the first chapter, which is the first kind of like full size successful garment I made, I do still have and I do occasionally wear. I feel like it's one of those things where when you look at the inside, you're like, gosh, I can't believe this is still in rotation. It really shouldn't be worn anymore. But lots of the other early things I sewed have gone on to other lives. So either I've donated them or I've given them away, or I've cut larger garments into smaller things. I think that's kind of a nice thing about sewing is you can sort of start anywhere and then you will be able to repurpose whatever you've made in some way.
So, when you received your first sewing machine, can you talk us through that experience? Because it wasn't as if you went to the local shop and bought one.
No, I was very lucky to inherit a sewing machine from my grandmother. It's not the machine I learnt to sew on. So I learnt to sew. I came back to New Zealand during COVID. And I'd been living in the UK with my partner at that stage. And when we came back, we stayed with his parents, and his mother had this like ancient, crotchety, temperamental machine that really did, it had been in rotation for like 50 years or something, but it was the machine I learned to sew on, and that was a lot of fun. It had its quirks. And then when I kind of we left New Plymouth, which is where we were living then, and moved to Auckland, which is where my family is from. And in Auckland, my grandmother at that stage had just, I guess, like her arthritis had just gotten sort of bad enough that she wasn't really sewing any longer. And I was telling her that I had started sewing and I was really enjoying it. And she said, "Oh, would you like to have my machine?" And so I was very lucky to inherit that. It's a very like hardy faff machine and still in very good nick. So I feel very lucky to have come across that.
And do you still have that machine with you in Melbourne?
I do, yes. It probably
Oh,
needs a service, to be honest.
and you also inherited a few more things, didn't you, from different people that you in your family?
Yes, yeah. So at the same time that I got the sewing machine, I was given, like a sort of a box of notions, so sort of miscellaneous tools and bits and bobs. I've got hundreds of buttons that don't match other buttons, but they're kind of like the sort of thing that I can't give away, and I don't really know what to do with them. I'm sure there'll be a project at some point. I did inherit like lots of pins and
Mm.
a nice pair of scissors, and yeah, it was a lovely way to begin.
I think a lot of people can relate to having a box or boxes or jars of mismatched buttons that they've
Yes.
inherited. And as you said, you have an emotional connection to these things that you just can't give away.
Yes, it's strange, isn't it? I don't quite know what to do with that. I think the sort of proper way to honor those memories is to turn them into some kind of project. But I haven't quite found the right one yet. So I think I'm waiting to see.
It's in the future.
Yeah, hopefully.
So one of the first jackets that you sewed was also very close to your heart and to your values.
Yeah, so I sewed a corduroy parlour jacket, which is a free pattern from the fabric store. And I had made the pattern many times before for other people. My boyfriend at the time, I'd made him a sort of corduroy version of this, and he wore it all the time. And I kind of borrowed it all the time. And I thought it's about time I made my own one. On the day that I made it or started making it, I'd had a bit of an upset at work. I guess someone had said something to me that I wasn't sure quite how to interpret it, but I felt like it was a little bit sort of racially charged, and I
Yep.
was a little bit upset by that. And I felt quite kind of helpless because it had been so subtle that, I guess that this is the nature of a microaggression, is you're not quite sure whether or not you're reading too far into it or how you could raise it or what to say or do.
Mm.
And so I kind of displaced that energy into making the jacket. And then once I'd made the jacket, it was just a plain black corduroy jacket. And I sort of thought, I want to do something to jazz this up a bit, but I don't want it to be over the top. That's not really my style. And so I thought about putting in some kind of lining, and I couldn't figure out what the lining should be. And then sort of serendipitously, I spoke to my grandmother on the phone, and I sort of like was hit by this idea suddenly that maybe I could sew these kind of linen patches that would be embroidered with the names of my female ancestors in Chinese and have those on the inside of the jacket. It was quite important to me that it be in the lining. I don't know, I don't really know why that is. I think it sort of was the feeling of having it kind of held close to your skin or be this private experience. I'd seen another sewist on Instagram who had made this incredibly beautiful jacket um, that had stitched into the lining with the embroidered words from, I think it was either letters or diary entries of her ancestors who had been in the Holocaust. And I thought that was just the most beautiful way of honoring, the lives of one's ancestors and kind of treasuring those family emotions. And so I really liked that idea, and I kind of ran with it. And I still have the jacket. I still wear it all the time. I often get asked about it because I think, from the outside, it's very unprepossessing. But then when you kind of, once I've taken it off and put it over a chair or something, someone's like, "Oh, what's on the inside there?" And then I like having a bit of a story about it.
Having those family members' names close to your heart would mean so much to you, and it is good that people actually ask and you can tell them that story. So then the next part of the like I've read the story and I just want you to explain a little bit. I know that a lot of listeners love not just books about sewing, but the connection that people have to what it is that they're sewing and the journey that they've gone on. So in your book, you moved from Auckland to Wellington because you got accepted to a master's. And part of that move meant that you had to have a raincoat. But to get a raincoat and so on a limited budget was a bit of a challenge. How did you go about it?
It was a bit of a challenge. I think by the time I moved to Wellington, I felt more confident in my sewing abilities. So I thought, yes, this is a good challenge for me. I'd like to sew something that's going to be quite practical and that I'll use. And then when I got to Wellington, I was sort of back to being a student, and so no longer had the budget to buy like a luxurious waxed organic cotton. I guess the sort of thing I would have wanted to make a raincoat out of if I had the choice of any material.
Mm.
And so I ended up having to compromise and getting a very sort of standard black nylon for the outer shell. But I quite enjoyed that process. It sort of meant that I could choose a bit more of a fun lining, and it sort of the stakes were a bit lower. I sort of felt like, if I screwed it up, it was all right. I'd be able to sort of do it again. The process of making the raincoat was quite interesting because it sort of was, I guess, a process of coming to terms with being in a new city and suddenly living in a place where the weather was less hospitable than it had been in Auckland. I quite often needed a raincoat. And so that was kind of quite a fun practical project. It definitely had its challenges. I think the raincoat I produced, I do still wear, but there are parts of it that if I were to make it again now, I would do quite differently.
But you managed it on a budget and you got a lot of
Yeah,
use out of it too.
I did. Yeah, I did.
Yeah. The next two things that you sewed that are in the book was the traditional Chinese dress, and I think that would have been very close to your heart when you took that project on.
It absolutely was. It was a bit of a mixed bag. I had very mixed feelings about that project. So I was making a cheongsam, which is the traditional Chinese dress with the kind of diagonal neckline, and it's usually quite fitted and sort of has a pencil skirt and an invisible zip, and it's very feminine. And it was something that up to this point in my life, I'd always, the Chinese side of my family, we sometimes would be worn on a special occasion. It was something that my grandmother wore a little bit when I was growing up, but it was something I'd always felt like was a little bit of a costume for me personally. I didn't like to wear it. I always felt like I had the wrong body type to wear it. And I guess also my heritage is mixed. So my mother's side of the family are Chinese, but my dad's side are white. And so there was also a part of me that felt like maybe I wasn't quite the right fit for that piece of clothing, or yeah, I just felt a bit mixed about wearing it, I suppose.
Mm.
But I decided that maybe the way to get around that was to make my own. I think this is an inevitable thing for sewists, is that at a certain point you sort of think, oh, I'll make anything that I'd like to wear and I'll experiment with it. But that was kind of a horror project, to be honest. It took me forever. The dress I produced, it had elements of the cheongsam, so it had the diagonal neckline and it
Mm-hmm.
had the sort of delicate closures. But I made the skirt something a bit more A-line and a little bit less fitted. And I chose a fabric that probably would not usually have been used for a cheongsam. I still don't really like wearing it. It still doesn't really feel like me. And it was incredibly arduous to make, and I made so many mistakes. I think every now and then you just have a project where everything seems to go wrong and you have to unpick 4 or 5 times. So this was that project for me. But after finishing it, I sort of realized that it had been a useful exercise anyway. And I think I will be sort of making cheongsam adjacent dresses for the rest of my life. I think it's like a garment that I want to re-engage with and keep thinking about. So yeah, it's been good to get that process started.
I'm really glad that you went through that process and created something as an end point to learn about what suits you as well, and it also gave you the ability to look at your background and your heritage.
Yeah, it was really meaningful.
I'm really glad that you chose the skirt style for that first one that suits your body type.
Yes, it made me feel a lot more comfortable.
I really loved reading about that. And I can understand how, as a sewist, our unpicking skills are at the forefront of everything else.
They're very important, aren't they, those skills?
They are. And then the last thing were the cargos that you made.
So they're right at the end of the book. I made a pair of cargo pants. I needed a pair of pants, and I thought, okay, what sort of pants will I make? And I'd made a lot of quite fitted pants in the past, and it no longer felt like those were quite my style. I think also the city I was living in, Wellington, maybe a little bit less buttoned up than Auckland.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted something that sort of reflected that culture a little bit. It was a little bit alternative, or yeah, I suppose almost a little bit genderless. And so I decided I would make these cargo pants, and they were just sort of a dreamy project because they were, in sort of contrast to making the cheongsam, they were very breezy to make. They fitted me well straight away, and they made me feel as if I kind of could put on a slightly different identity when I wore them, which was very freeing. So they were good fun.
And it seems like every step of the way when you've made something that you've worn, it's meant something to you personally, but also to you as who you are as you're developing in, the role that you were in Auckland, doing your masters, and now you're here in Melbourne.
Yeah, I think so. I think there are different clothes for different seasons, and I think part of sewing is not over consuming and sort of knowing exactly what you need and making just that and getting good use out of it. But another part of it is also having fun and kind of being able to play with what you want to wear and what you want to feel like on any given day. So I really appreciated that about it.
And it was good that you also discussed how when you were going through your own COVID illness, how you felt, and then how you made sure that, you're still back into sewing, but you did it at your own pace.
I'm sure a lot of people can relate to getting very ill during COVID. And I mean, that's still going on. It's not sort of over.
Yeah.
And I think that, in some ways it's been kind of a useful phenomenon in waking people up to knowing their own limits a little bit and knowing when they need to rest. And I think sewing is quite a lovely hobby to be able to do that with, because there are many small things you can do at a sort of low energy cost level, and then sort of working your way up to a bigger project, or just doing small increments and then kind of having a big burst of energy on a Sunday afternoon or something. It lends itself well to a variety.
I mean, when you're working full time or studying full time, it's one of those things that you can, if you're sewing a particular project like cargoes, you could just work on one thing. And then, when you've got a little bit of time, or maybe decide on sewing something and then moving back into life where you've got to work or study or whatever.
It does fit around the edges quite well.
Yeah. I think what I wanted to find out from you is if there are listeners out there who have been given a sewing machine or sewing notions from someone in their family, what's the best way to go about it? Because this has happened to you a few times. When someone says, oh, so-and-so has given up sewing and they'd like to give you either a sewing machine or the fabrics, what's the best way to go about accepting them or saying thank you, but then passing them on? Because you've gone through that experience of accepting a lot of heirloom sewing tools.
I feel like the best thing is just to consider whether or not you have space in your life for it. I think that it's very legitimate to say, I've got nowhere to store those things, or I don't really think I'm going to be someone who gets into sewing, and I think it would make more sense to give them to someone else. But I also think, I don't know, if somebody offers you something lovely that has this kind of heritage to it, I think it's a wonderful thing to accept. And I think I would never in a million years have thought I would be a sewist. If you'd asked me when I was 15 years old, I had no interest whatsoever. I didn't think I needed another indoor hobby. I've got plenty of those. But I think it's something that can be I think the act of making things only becomes more important as you get older, and having the tools to do that, or having, sort of being given a surprise gift of having a sewing machine or some notions in your life is maybe a good way to get started. So I don't know, I would encourage listeners to take it on.
That's great. Maddie, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and telling your story. And I hope you have a lot of success with your book called Patchwork, a Sewist Diary.
Thank you so much for having me, Maria.
Thanks. This episode of Organised Style Podcast for Sew Over 50 was both video and audio produced by me, Maria Thea Harris, in my sewing room, with permission of Maddie Ballard. Sound by Knife on YouTube. Many thanks for the ongoing monthly support of the podcast Patreon contributors. Their paid Patreon membership enables me to create these video and audio podcasts for you for free. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and write a review. You can find Sew Organised Style Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. And yes, if you live in Australia and decide to purchase your own Mimi Queen, which is a custom dress form, I'll be your body scanner for Mimi Queens UK. Make sure you go back and listen to our free Sew Over 50 podcast episodes on Sew Organised Style. Make sure you tag your Instagram post with @ShareSew50 to To find all of the Sober 50 sewists you've missed seeing, since the tag search on Instagram went bust. I look forward to joining you in your sewing room next time. Stay safe, everyone.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.